For months, I had only ever heard this piece played through samples on my computer. Then I sat down and was able to hear it played live by a professional orchestra. Almost immediately, I realized that writing music for an orchestra and actually hearing an orchestra play your music are two very different things. This is what I learned from recording with the RTVE Symphony Orchestra. Before this experience, my orchestral writing existed in one of two places: on paper and inside a computer. Mockups can sound insanely realistic, especially nowadays, but they cannot prepare you for the experience of musicians interpreting your music live in real time on stage or during a recording session. I had written this piece, I thought I knew what it sounded like, and then a real orchestra actually played it. Lesson number 1. The orchestra is not a MIDI mockup. Now, I understand a lot of people will probably be like, well, duh, that's kind of obvious. But I think there are some concepts in there that most people will look past and not actually understand it until they actually come face to face with a recording session. The main idea here is the orchestra is going to reveal things that your mockup doesn't have. So I'm talking about things like instrumental blend, natural phrasing, articulation, balance, timbre, and the difference between programmed dynamics and human emotion. The main thing I'm trying to say here is an orchestra is not just going to reproduce what you hear in your head. They're going to interpret what you've written. A MIDI mockup can tell you if notes technically work side by side structurally and everything like that, but a real orchestra will tell you if the piece can actually breathe. This brings me to the second lesson I learned, which is notation is a form of communication. The concept that I'm trying to hint on here is specifically that the score is not just documentation, but a way to communicate to your musicians. The film scoring program that I was a part of while I was in Spain and had the chance to record with this orchestra, one of the big topics that we talked about almost every single day was clarity. You can never be too clear on your score. Things like, is the articulation clear? Are you specifically telling your players that you want this to be played a staccato 8th note and not just a 16th note? Do you understand what I'm saying here? You want the phrasing, you want the idea to be communicated as fast and as clearly as possible. Because in recording sessions, time is the name of the game. Time is money. Things like, are your dynamics meaningful? Are you using them as a symbol of how loud they should play? Or are you using them more so as an attitude, a way to approach the phrase or the note? Obviously, things like, are the parts readable? Engraving is a huge thing. It takes up a lot of time, but it's important. You want it to be clear about entry points and about how long to sustain, and if you want them to be expressivo, and all sorts of things like that. The best thing that you can ask yourself for all of these different things is your notation clearly communicating your musical intention? So just as a simple example, we're going to take a look at my score from my recording session. Measure 35 in the harp, I have an arpeggio marked with it saying fast and on beat. When I talk about you can never be too clear, this demonstrates and communicates to your player exactly how you want the arpeggio to be played. So when I mark it as fast here, I'm talking about the intervals between each note being plucked. And on beat, meaning that all of the notes need to feel fast enough that they all feel like they're still being plucked on one, despite them being played at different times. Lesson number 3, you have to know what actually matters. What am I talking about here? When you're composing alone, it is super easy to obsess over little things like tiny voicing details, microscopic articulations, one note in an inner voice, minor balance issues. There's so many different things. But in a real session, you have to learn to prioritize. Not every detail deserves equal attention. When you're working with an orchestra, you need to identify a number of different things. Things like, what is the most important musical idea? What needs to be communicated clearly? What can be adjusted? What is not worth wasting time on? One of the biggest lessons I learned here is that orchestration is a tool in helping you decide where your attention should go during the recording session. So we're going to take a look at another example from my score. In measure 20, I have a string quartet going on. The violins are in divisi, legato, along with the violas, and the moving line is in the cellos. Specifically here, the first take that we took, I remember specifically the violas, the violins we're sitting back on the pulse, maybe dragging even a little bit, which is kind of the idea I was going for. So that idea was conveyed well. The cellos, however, since they had the moving line, they were pushing forward almost like they were ahead of the beat almost. So it was very disconnected. And this goes back to the idea that I was talking about, how notation can be used as communication to your players. They're interpreting what you wrote. So the more specific, the better off you are. So simply just adding something like sit back or even just slightly drag could have conveyed that, and it wouldn't have caused a problem in the very first recording or the very first take. I specifically remember after the first take, because I went up and the very first thing I said was talking about measure 20, the cellos feel like they're pushing, and I need them to sit back. I need them to feel like they are almost playing legato quarter notes, same as the violins and violas here. And on the second take, boom, fixed it just like that. Now, before I mention this next point, every recording session is always going to be a little bit different. For example, here, we only had 15 minutes to record for each composer that was at the program. 15 minutes was really only enough time for most people to have 2 or 3 takes. So this next example has to do with what is not worth wasting time on. I have an accelerando from measure 38 all the way to 48. Now, the speed changes from the quarter note being 128 all the way up to 155. Accelerandos are very difficult to do, especially when you don't have a click track. And in my situation, we didn't have any click tracks. But during this part, the orchestra was not able to speed up anywhere near the tempo that I originally had notated. Because you have to think, are you going to spend more time on complaining that it's not up to tempo, and they get it up to tempo, but it doesn't sound the quality that you want? Probably not. Then again, these are just simple examples, but there's a number of things that you always need to keep thinking about in terms of the amount of time that you have, because time is your enemy. It is not on your side. I could go on a lot more about things that you could think about in terms of what could be adjusted. I could show you more examples, but I think the idea is there. Mainly, you want to not waste any time. Lesson number 4. The human element changes your music. You need to think more so, your players, they are individual people. Now, this is another thing that's like, well, duh, they're all their own person. But what I mean specifically here is each person's going to bring a different interpretation. They have different experiences. They have a different instinct and approach to the music. They have different energy, and they have different musical personalities. There are so many different instances where the orchestra played a phrase or a passage differently than I could have ever imagined it sounding. But specifically here, this does not mean it's a failure or the composition didn't work there. The goal is to create music that can live in the hands of the musicians. The musicians are what communicate your music to the screen or to the audience. Wherever it goes, they are what brings your music to life. So there are so many different things you can't account for. So one of the main things that I had to learn basically right off the bat when they played the very first note of my piece is you need to let go of the mock-up. You need to let go of the way that you've heard your piece. The goal is not always to force the orchestra to sound exactly like your mock-up. I think it's important to always go in with your central ideas in mind, like the previous lesson about making sure that you are focusing on priority things, conveying the right feelings, the right meanings, the right ideas, all of that. But going in with an open mind that when you hear something different, you're not immediately opposed to it. Lesson number 5. Hearing your music performed changes your relationship with it. Now, everybody's situation is a little bit different. Some people compose for months, years. Some people compose for a couple days or a week. And then suddenly you hear other people perform it. Now, here what I'm getting at is when you work on a piece long enough, it becomes much more difficult to hear it objectively. What do I mean by hearing it objectively? Well, you spent the most time with the piece. You remember every problem you had with it. You remember every revision you made. You remember all of the parts that you deleted. But when an orchestra plays it, what was internal is outside of your control now. And this comes back to the whole idea of you need to let go of the mock-up. You need to let go of the things that you hear. There's many things that, you're going to have to probably compromise on. And again, this doesn't mean that you need to compromise on who you are as a composer, who you are as an artist, but specifically here is you need to remain open-minded. Now, we can wrap this back into the whole notation and how important clarity is topic, If it's a part that you are not willing to compromise on, and it's one of those main ideas that you need to spend, and prioritize, then making sure that you focus more on the clarity and the notation aspect, it becomes that much more important. You can never be too specific. The last lesson number 6 that I learned, is the gap between good and great often comes with preparation. This is the biggest thing that I want to convey to people out there. A professional recording session is not a place to discover how your piece should be played. You should be going into this with knowing what the important moments are in your piece. What can change, what cannot change, knowing those priorities and understanding things that you are willing to compromise on. Those are all great things to come in prepared for. Now, I don't intend on making this video too long, but the main things that I want to leave off with are a couple different topics. Now, the point of this video is to not make it sound like I've mastered everything. These are just things and key things that I've taken away from this program that I just came back from. My personal experience with the RTVE Symphony Orchestra was amazing. I was able to go in with an open mind, thankfully enough. Not letting those things, there were many different things that discouraged me during the recording session, and they're a setback. And so it's stressful, of course it is. Writing for orchestra is not just about knowing what every instrument can do. It's about understanding how music moves from your imagination to the page, and then to your players, and finally into the air. A computer can help you imagine the sound. A score can communicate the idea. But the orchestra is where the music finally comes to life. Before the session, I thought I knew what my piece sounded like. During the session, the orchestra showed me things I couldn't hear alone. And after the session, I realized that my piece was no longer just mine. And that changed how I think about composing.